Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in the History of Bad Ideas, I'm talking to the political scientist and election expert Jane Green about an idea that contains a large element of myth. It is the idea that what really matters in politics, particularly when it comes to winning elections, is political leadership. Do political leaders actually win elections? If they don't, what does decide elections? And if they don't, what are political leaders for? Jane, we're going to be talking about why people overstate the significance of political leadership, particularly at election time. The idea that leaders win elections is the core idea we're going to be exploring. But just to frame that, I think we should probably start with trying to establish when political leadership does matter, because clearly we're not saying political leadership doesn't matter at all in a party system like the British one, which is where we're going to be focusing. So when does it matter before we get onto the questions of why people overstate it?
It's such an interesting topic, David, because one of the reasons this is so interesting is that we all understand, don't we, intuitively, that leaders are, they're kind of a fulcrum for how we think about politics. And they really, really obviously have very, very important effects. But the problem comes in then isolating what those effects are and when those effects are greater and for which parties and so on. So there's not kind of one uniform answer. But I think, clearly one of the ways people think about this is, you just pick someone that people like and people want to listen to, and your chances, your fortunes are going to be revived. But it's much more complicated than that. So obviously, one of the ways leaders hugely matter is through setting strategic direction, policy, vision, values, ideological direction, all of the rest of it. And that doesn't just come from one person, but a leader obviously makes a huge, huge difference. Another way in which leaders clearly matter is if they're seen to be failing, then, things start to fall apart. And one of the really important things that any political party needs is the confidence of the electorate behind it. And if there's disunity, if there's all kinds of factionalism and fighting because the leader doesn't command the respect of their political party, then clearly that's a sort of indirect effect. So there are loads of indirect effects. The big question is, are there direct effects of, this person seems like a great guy or a great woman, and therefore, I'm going to take more interest in that party and vote for them. And that is much, 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 much more difficult to pin down. The effects are much smaller than we might have assumed. But unfortunately, lots of people kind of jumble all those things up and assume that that's the case.
So we'll come on to the ways in which leaders can trash the brand, because I think people can think of recent examples of that. But as you say, there's a tendency, I think, and I also want to know whether this is a tendency that's accelerated recently, to see leadership as the absolute fulcrum, to think that the question of who leads, of course, the question of changing the leader as a way of reviving the party's fortunes, and particularly at election times. And one of the challenges in the British political system is it's almost a shorthand. It's a journalistic shorthand, but I think people use it in everyday life to say that a British election is picking the Prime Minister. And it's clearly not. Technically, it's not. Formally, it's not. People are voting for MPs and the MPs pick the Prime Minister. And even that's not strictly true, because usually it's taken for granted that a party with a majority, the leader will already be established as the one that the MPs will vote for. But I think it is taken for granted that that is maybe even the primary thing that people do at election time. And therefore, if you're picking the Prime Minister, the question of who the candidates are really matters. Is that the thing that is most overstated here in a way? The idea that what determines electoral outcomes is voters' choices about who they want to lead the country?
Absolutely, David. I think that's the absolute critical thing that's overstated. And there's no getting away from the fact that the way you framed it in journalism and the way we talk about elections and politics, it's almost self-fulfilling, right? So you almost get this kind of reinforcement of the idea that leaders are everything because, leaders run campaigns, they have schedules in election campaigns where you see them every day. They're trying to set the agenda, and so the political journalistic crowd is then following that story in election time. But what that doesn't give enough focus to, I think, is the fact that if you think about where we get our political preferences from, the leader is right at the end of the chain. So if you think about where those preferences come from, there's a classic idea theory in political science. It was called the funnel of causality, right? So if you think about the first things that happen to you when you're growing up and you get your politics, right? You're in the home, you're in the household, friends, family, you're ideologically and politically socialized through your social class, through your position, through all of the things that form you. And from there, we get some of our kind of deepest political values that are actually very difficult to shift. And even some of our outlook and ideology, even through things like experiencing inequality, experiencing different kind of class backgrounds, the area in which you live, that really changes the way or affects the way that you see politics. It kind of creates your lens, if you like. And people form ideologies, they form attachments to political parties, less so now than they used to, but nevertheless, this idea of a political identity is kind of one of the first things you then bring to your politics, right? So then, let's go a little bit up the chain and you get those kind of more important fundamentals of politics, like how is the economy doing? Am I feeling better off? Are things running well? All of those kind of evaluations that are really important. And certainly people that follow politics, political journalists know that those things are important, but they're not changing in the campaign. So they're not a story. And so they don't have a day-to-day kind of currency. And then, once you've got to that position, you're essentially voters are looking in a choice set of, okay, I probably would only look at these parties in the left bloc, or I'd only look at these parties in the right bloc. Which person, which kind of, what are the campaign messages and the kind of short-term factors? Now, obviously, a leader is certainly a prime minister is very influential on whether the economy is doing very well or whether people sense that things are going well in terms of delivery issues, the top issues, currently immigration and cost of living. That's not just the leader. And one way to think about this is, if you have a positive or negative view of Nigel Farage, right? Imagine Nigel Farage was leader of the Labour Party. That isn't going to swing it for you if you don't like Nigel Farage, and vice versa on the other political side. So it's kind of worth remembering that an individual is essentially, they might kind of epitomize, or they might characterize, or they might be a shortcut for people to think about politics. We might even talk about leaders more in campaigns because they're kind of top of the mind. But all of that background is the thing that really we bring to our political choices in the first place.
Like I say, I want to come on to the question of whether this is accelerating. It could be to do with the information environment. It could be to do with the way that politics gets covered and discussed. But one of the things you said there is really interesting, which is that, of course, we tend to blame leaders. So if the economy is going badly, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, 5 years ago? If that's a question that's in your mind, you might think, I don't feel better off. It's the government's fault. And this person is prime minister. So there's a sort of negative association with that person, which on one level makes it feel like, well, leadership does matter. But the other way of looking at it is you would think that whoever was the leader. There is all of that political science. I think the most notorious example is the one that's often cited from American political science, which is to discover that the number of shark attacks in a particular eastern seaboard district tended to correlate with how people felt about the incumbents. And clearly, the people in power had no control over the behavior of the sharks. So it's that interesting double effect in the sense that just because people blame the leader or credit the leader doesn't mean that leadership matters, because the other implication of that is that whoever was the leader would get the credit or the blame. And that feels to me like one of the things that's almost hardest to navigate here. Leadership does matter, but it doesn't.
If you're running a statistical model, right, you can actually, what we try to do is we say, right, here's a bundle of factors. Let's go and put them in our models, and let's go and isolate each factor by taking into consideration the other factors, right? So we say, right, once we take all those things into account, what's the unique effects of this additional factor, this variable, this leader thing? And once political scientists have done that, they find that the size of that effect is very small. And it's a causal question. I mean, taking aside the shark attacks thing, which I think is, not necessarily the most robust thing in the world, but it's very memorable. But the general principle, for example, was it fair that Gordon Brown got the rap for the financial crisis when that's a global economic crisis? Is it fair that Keir Starmer is essentially getting the rap for what has been a economic crisis that's founded in Russia and also in Iran? But fundamentally, there's another horrible word from political science, I'm afraid, but there's an endogeneity problem. There's a causal problem there, where if you just want to say, right, let's now take everything else that we bring to politics into account, the blame and everything else, what's the small effect of a leader? Well, it's very minimal in that context. Having said that, of course, you have political choices when those things happen. So politics isn't just about trends, right? It's not a constant thing. So if you think leaders, are they mattering more now, or do they always matter, or do these kind of bigger blame things always matter? Actually, these bigger events, what they do is they give context and they contextualize what matters. And so when we see big shocks, big economic shocks, or major kind of moments where a government is held to account for how it's handling something incredibly salient and significant, then we see those kind of competence things matter more. In that sense, perhaps leaders matter sometimes in those major events, right? When what comes like COVID, think about COVID. Of course, that's a global phenomenon. Of course, people don't lay the blame purely at the foot of a leader. Nevertheless, they are looking to someone to navigate through very difficult times, and how that person handles that is, of course, part of the calculation.
Something else you said that's really interesting and important is that so we're formed, we're socialized, we have background views, we then come to opinions about some big questions. They may be broadly ideological, they may be more practical to do with recent experiences of the NHS, whatever it is. But within that, in British politics, certainly at the moment, there are voting blocs. And the blocks, you can miss it in that you can see a lot of volatility, Labour people switching green, Tories switching to reform. And it feels like people are sort of sweeping across the political spectrum, trying to find the party and the leader that suits them. But actually, the blocks, and you've done a lot of work on this and spoken about it, the blocks are pretty fixed. And the boundaries of those blocks are quite rigid, certainly post Brexit in the British context. And it's not like a strong leader, a popular leader, is dragging people across that big divide. The divide and the larger blocks looks much more like something that leadership cannot change. So there might be movement within the blocks. Polanski, Starmer, Badenoch, Farage. But the idea that Farage is drawing Labour voters over to the other side, that feels like it's part of the myth here in a way.
That's right. And one of the funny, I say funny, it's kind of strange and perplexing changes that happened post Brexit in the way we talked about British politics. And I'm sure this is not just confined to British politics. So we see the similar kind of related debates in the US where so much focus has been on polarization. And yet, if you look beneath the surface, you see there's so much more in common across these divides. But, one of the funny things was that in politics since Brexit, it was almost like you could only see the world ideologically, that people became preoccupied by the idea that we're divided on Brexit lines and we're divided ideologically. And then I think a lot of analysis of politics has been like, well, if you just say this, then maybe you'll get these voters. And if you just say this, maybe you'll get these voters. And it's such an oversimplification. And what has mattered hugely since COVID really is this sense of governing competence, and what was then followed from COVID by cost of living, a prolonged cost of living crisis. So you've got that as your kind of primary driver, but you're right, beneath the surface, there's still this very, very clear sense of ideological difference. But you have to think about those two key dimensions of politics, not one or the other. They're running together. And so they're both very important. And so is the left-right divide still, but it's overlaid now with Brexit and associated issues. So since Brexit, we have indeed seen switching primarily being within those blocks. And that was particularly accentuated in the last election, where we saw a high degree of fragmentation, but nevertheless, it was in those blocks. And so, you can have a debate about what's the reason for that, but so much of it in 2024 was about governing competence, right? It was the Conservatives trashing their brand, and then right voters looking for an alternative on the right, and then left voters looking to punish the Conservatives primarily as well, and figuring out different ways to do so, which gave Labour such a large majority. So you've got this kind of within bloc switching. I think there are different primary reasons for what's going on at the moment, but you're right to say, once you've got, I mean, I would say it's not just ideological blocks that undermine the kind of importance of leaders, it's ideological blocks and its performance. Now, that's critical, isn't it? Because leaders aren't irrelevant to those two things. What Kemi Badenoch decides to say is not irrelevant to where those right bloc voters go. And what Keir Starmer has chosen to say is not irrelevant. Of course, it's hugely germane to where voters have decided to go. And Andy Burnham coming in as Prime Minister in the United Kingdom is going to be hugely important for where left bloc voters and perhaps some right bloc voters decide to go. But it's not all about them as likable people or unlikable people. It's about where they take their parties.
Do you think this overstating of the significance of leaders, their personalities, as you say, their likability, some people think, elections are decided by who you'd like to have a beer with, and then it gets turned on its head and it's like people will vote for the person that they think would like to have a beer with them, and on it goes. But do you think that has become more exaggerated recently because of the information environment in which we live, the media environment in which we live, the way in which politics is reported, the speed of the news cycle, the hunger for the story? The cliche is that the trouble with journalism is it treats it as a horse race, and it's not a horse race for the reasons that we've talked about. But is it getting exaggerated, do you think, recently? In the British case, for instance, I have a lifetime of memories of this going back a fair way, but not all the way back. It feels to me like it's got more exaggerated, and indeed part of the churn of prime ministers has something to say about this. Do you think it's becoming more pronounced, this focus on the individual, the personality, the leader, the gaffe, the clever thing to say, the well-run campaign?
If we want to see a moment where this really changed, you'd have to go post television, wouldn't you? Like that's where you'd see a really big change. The proliferation of broadcast media and seeing faces on the telly. So, let's contextualize it as a kind of the starting point of when we would have expected this to have really significantly changed. And then I think there's some ironies here, right? Because one of the things that's really driving politics at the moment is kind of big global shocks, the economy, what's the bigger forces at work. So if you think, what are we really focused on in our daily lives? It's not leaders, clearly. It's all of those things. But the political narrative has clearly, in the UK, become more obsessed with leaders because I think parties have. Just by the fact that we've had so many changes of Prime Minister in such a short period of time, it's undeniable that that has been a major focus, right? And one of the risks here is that political parties are struggling with profoundly difficult policy challenges and almost looking for simple solutions. So, okay, this is, whatever's happened, Boris Johnson, Conservative MPs decided at some point, right, enough's enough. We can't have Boris Johnson as our leader. People have lost confidence in him and he's not going to get it back. Okay, so then there's a contest and we get Liz Truss, then there's a disaster and we get Rishi Sunak, and then there's an election and then we have Keir Starmer, and now here we are with Andy Burnham. And so political journalists would tell you they're just following the politics. They're just following the fact that this is what political parties are trying to prioritise. And I think there's truth in that it's not fair to say because politics has been talking about this, because this is what politics has been doing in the UK for so long. And let's take it again over to the US. Donald Trump is demanding that level of attention on him. And if you're reporting the fact that Donald Trump is doing this, that, or the other, then you're reporting what's politically significant at the moment. So I don't know that it's fair to sort of blame the narrative, but I do think there has been a misplaced emphasis in political parties on just how much change one likable or more slightly more charismatic or whatever leader can do. And a lot of this came from overstating the significance of Johnson in 2019, his individual appeal on that election outcome. And I think the same might have slightly been true for Keir Starmer, although to a lesser extent in 2024.
Do you think part of this is the Americanization of British politics? Because ours is not a presidential system, and yet sometimes we're told it's becoming more presidential. One of the things that was imported from the United States and is it's a pretty recent phenomenon is the leadership debate. And the leadership debate almost encapsulates what we're talking about here. And I remember when they came in 2010, and I vividly remember what was called, this will sound like a quaint term for people who either aren't British or don't remember this, Clegg mania. Nick Clegg was thought to have performed very well in the leadership debates, partly because the other two party leaders, Gordon Brown and David Cameron, deferred to him. The catchphrase was, I agree with Nick, just because he was the centrist guy. And so it was easy for them to agree with Nick and not with the other. And there was this feeling Nick Clegg has changed the course of British politics. You're this young, thought to be relatively charismatic, I don't know what people think of him now, leader. There were a couple of polls where the Liberal Democrats were ahead. And I can still remember the shock on election night where they performed exactly as they had performed, more or less exactly, at the previous election. So at the previous election, they'd been led by Charles Kennedy. They'd had another leader, Ming Campbell, in between. And suddenly here was proof of what we're talking about, which is it felt like it had made a huge difference. It was absolutely driving the narrative. I remember watching the debates and thinking, this is exciting. Like something has changed. And it turned out to be an illusion. So that feels like the import of the leadership debate, and we've had so many of them since, is part of the A, Americanization of British politics, but B, actually illustrating what we're talking about here, which is the leadership debate itself is a little bit of a red herring in an election. So much attention paid to it. In the States and here, they rarely change anything.
Absolutely. So if you look at kind of across the board, the evidence shows that, I mean, campaigns rarely change anything, let alone leader debates within campaigns. Now, some campaigns do, of course, and some don't. Think of 2017, where lots of kind of undecided Labour voters went back to Labour under Jeremy Corbyn. During that campaign, Theresa May ran a very I was going to say she ran a negative campaign. She didn't mean to. It was a negative campaign for Theresa May in 2017. So sometimes campaigns matter. I think leader debates could matter under some circumstances. But what they do tend to do, and there's some evidence of this in the US where there's greater evidence for their effects because they've been so central and so important for so long, is that they tend to link up people's preferences more closely to the leaders or to the parties of the leaders. And so what I find fascinating about leader debates, and I'm a big fan of them for this reason, is that it's the very first time you're actually seeing side by side a comparison of platforms, essentially. The individual, yeah, you might be looking at them and thinking, oh, they seem all right, or they look like they're uncomfortable, or this one's looks a bit sweaty, or whatever it is, right? Whatever that is. It's kind of curious, right? We're human after all, aren't we? It's a little bit like a sort of goggle box. If you watch that in the UK where, people watching television, it's fascinating human psychology to them. But fundamentally, what they do is they compare side by side different answers to the same question. Say it's on tax, say it's on the NHS, say it's on the economy, whatever the issue is. And I think, what they have been shown to do, as I say, is more closely link people's preferences to parties. They inform about positions, about platforms. Now, they don't inform for very many people because the kind of people that tune in would be normally the kinds of people who might have already come to their own conclusions already about politics. So they're not going to have big effects. But certainly what they do is they point you to thinking, okay, maybe politics is becoming more kind of leader-centric. And I think it's not that simple.
Do you think British politics is becoming more presidential, either in actuality or in the way in which it is presented to us? And if it is, do we know when it started? Did it start with Tony Blair? Did it start with Margaret Thatcher? Is ours a more presidential system than it used to be, given it's not a presidential system?
Oh, David, you've asked me a huge question there, which goes into kind of the strength of Parliament, parliamentary committees, whether number 10 is really centralised. The question of how presidential we are goes to the system, right? It goes to the power of Parliament, goes to the power of the executive, whether one individual has a particularly dominating style, right? That's what you're really asking. Like, has the system fundamentally changed? Our unwritten constitution, has it fundamentally changed? And the answer to that is no, right? But of course, some leaders may have a sort of a greater grip on the machinery of government. And that was often said about Tony Blair, how he centralised a lot of decision making in Number 10 in order to have greater clarity and strategic control. The argument was that a kind of more presidential system? So the system fundamentally hasn't changed, right? But obviously some leaders may exert more power over the others. Certainly having a huge majority is probably the most important thing, right? Under the circumstances of a huge majority, obviously you can do more, you can have more leeway, you bring your party with you more frequently, more easily.
Unless you're Keir Starmer, it should be so.
Well, yeah, but he still had, he still had a workable majority until very controversial decisions such as the welfare U-turns and all the rest of it. So that's a system question. you know, is it presented more as a presidential system? I don't know. Probably yes. I mean, probably over decades, you could see that happening more and more. Probably yes, but I don't know.
So I want to ask you about some of the examples that you've touched on, because I think it's always interesting and also interesting to think about some of the counterfactuals here. Because one of the ways to think about whether leaders matter is to ask the question, what might have happened with a different leader? So the Tony Blair first landslide in 1997, which I remember vividly, and it was very much associated with him. It was thought to be his victory, maybe the scale of it, but also after all of those years of Conservative rule, 4 elections that the Conservatives had won, the traumatic defeat to John Major the previous time. Along comes this fresh-faced, likable, I guess. Back then, people may have a different view now, but back then he was certainly thought to be likable leader who was able to appeal to people who might not normally have voted Labour. This huge election win, it's Blair's triumph. He's photographed with Blair's babes, all of that. His name is attached to everything. And there's an election where people think Tony Blair won a landslide. That's how they express it. They don't say Labour won a landslide, Tony Blair won a landslide. Did he? I mean, so for instance, had John Smith lived, and it's a difficult question to answer, but had John Smith lived, would it have been very different, the outcome of that election, do you think?
The question to ask is, had John Smith lived? The other question to ask is, had someone else been able to moderate the Labour Party and challenge the unions in the way that the Labour Party did under Tony Blair, able to, again, we're sort of going into the details now, British political history, but abolish Clause 4, which was part of Labour's rules and had been a very symbolic shift of Labour not being so under the control of the unions and making that sort of transformation that Labour underwent. I'm being very careful to say Labour, right? Because I want to kind of have this thought experiment. Like, imagine Tony Blair's not in there, right? And so the idea, the concept of new Labour, of becoming a party that was for the middle classes, that had recognised that it wasn't able to win elections because the size of the working class was becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. They needed to branch out and become a more moderate middle ground party. Those policy shifts. The other thing you need to ask is, had another Labour leader came in, been able to do that, and also benefited from the fact that the Conservatives had been in power since 1979, and in 1992 and 93 gone through a hideous time, which was to do with their trashing of their brand at the time, although we probably wouldn't have put it in those words of brands, but they had lost their reputation for economic competence in the sort of whole debacle around the exchange rate mechanism crisis, Britain having to leave the exchange rate mechanism temporarily and all the rest of it, the devaluation of the currency. And then, under John Major, go through a period where there was just story after story about sleaze. And so this was, all kinds of things going on, embarrassing various Conservative ministers. So the stage is set for a Labour victory because of those Conservative party problems, because of the length of time the Conservative government had been in power, and because Labour looked like a party that wanted to represent a larger portion of the country, right? It had taken a number of symbolic steps to transform itself. Now, arguably, Tony Blair might have been the only individual who was capable of taking the Labour Party through that process. But I think people would argue that John Smith could have done the same.
And do you think, in a way, I don't want to overstate this, I don't want to make this a sort of overly deterministic story, but there comes a point with parties when they have lost 4 elections in a row, where some change of that kind is inevitable. As it were, the time was right for the kinds of changes that Blair and Brown too. So there's also the counterfactual. What if they'd gone with Brown first? I think the majority might not have been as big. I think a Scottish leader might not have been quite as successful, though Tony Blair is in some ways Scottish, but a more overtly Scottish leader. But that the time was right. And we think we overstate the agency of the leader. Here comes this politician finally to grapple with it, to sort of fight with this beast that is the Labour Party and wrestle it into submission. And actually, the door was ajar. And probably most leaders would have walked through it. They'd have done it in a different way. The outcome might have been different. Of course, all elections would have somewhat different outcomes depending on all sorts of contingencies. But we tend to maybe overstate the agency of leadership in this because the Labour Party was grappling with the fact it lost 4 elections in a row. And what it ended up doing, you feel like was the sort of thing that it might have done anyway, regardless of the leader.
You're making me think about something interesting, David. Perhaps there's something in human beings, right? That leaders are heuristics, they're shortcuts, they're ways of us making sense of the world. And there's probably something just very human about this, right? That you see something happen like that in 1997 and you give credit to the individual because, we give credit to the leaders of organizations, of business leaders. Of course, we don't really think the chief executive of, some really successful company that's made its billions, is solely responsible for those successes. But there's something very human and human psychology about this. So I think that's interesting. I'd be really surprised if there wasn't quite a lot of evidence to suggest that we have a sort of tendency anyway. The other thing I wanted to say, though, was just bringing it back a little bit more to sort of the very recent political history. Just as we were thinking about Tony Blair's success and giving Tony Blair credit in 1997, are leaders just frankly lucky because they happen to come in at a time when their party is probably going to do well anyway, right? There's two things I think that are relevant to this. One is that, yes, what we see in opinion polls again and again and again is that governments tend to just lose support the longer they govern, which is known as cost of ruling or cost of governing, right? So essentially, of course, you win elections by doing better, and that support tends to dwindle over time. And so in a sense, that goes to the thing of, do oppositions win elections or do governments lose them? Governments have to kind of see that support ebb away over time for another party under any leader to have a good chance of victory. But the other thing, in 2024 is, what do you have? What are the key factors, right? Well, you have a very unpopular Conservative government. You have very, very high, what's called efficiency in the votes to seats translation for the Labour Party because of tactical voting, because of the way that many people on the left wanted to get rid of the Tories, because of the rise of reform, which was down to the loss of Conservative popularity. Essentially, you get that kind of block-based support that we were talking about. You lose a load of support, well, then it's going to shift right. And so there were a number of factors beneath the hood that really meant that Labour's vote was going to be efficient, no matter what Labour did, right? And this isn't just about Starmer, it's all about, there are lots of people in parties that take credit when they win elections, right? Like genius campaign strategists win elections. But when they lose elections, they're not going to say, well, I wasn't a genius after all, I was really bad, I had really bad luck. But no one says, oh, we got really lucky there, do they?
So the Keir Starmer example is interesting because we've been talking about the ways in which maybe journalists or people who write about politics, not political scientists, but people who just talk about it in an everyday sense, overstate the importance of leaders. Keir Starmer seems to me someone who has fallen into that trap himself. I was really struck by when he came under pressure. It was reported, you can't be absolutely certain what happens in cabinet, but it was reported that he would periodically say to his cabinet, "We are all here because of me and Morgan McSweeney." And at one point, I was so frustrated by this, I found myself writing as a provocation. I wouldn't want to defend this to the death, that Rebecca Long Bailey would have won that election. So people don't remember who Rebecca Long Bailey was. She was Keir Starmer's rival. She was the Corbynite rival, with the caveat that had she won, she might have split the Labour Party and then they wouldn't have won the election. But if she'd held the party together as a way of saying, it wasn't you, Keir, it wasn't your friend Morgan, the structural conditions were so set in stone that almost any Labour leader who could hold the party together wouldn't have won as big a majority. As you say, the vote distribution wouldn't have been so efficient among the people who wanted the Tories out. But it felt to me like one of Starmer's mistakes is he oversold the significance of his own leadership in that election outcome, or of his genius strategist, Morgan McSweeney, who people think is less of a genius than they did back then.
We do political science, right? One of the reasons I really believe in the value and the importance of careful, slow work and its bringing to bear on British politics is because otherwise politics is full of myths, right? Like, because it obviously suits people to sustain them. And I do think in 2024, it was a myth that Labour's campaign was responsible for the efficiency in that vote, right? You can't say it had no effect. You can't say that a moderate Labour Party wasn't quite as intimidating or threatening to those people that, blah, 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 all the rest of it. But to say that they were responsible for that outcome, that they took primary credit for it, I think is really a myth. What really mattered is that the left vote coalesced and the right vote split. And what really mattered to that was a lot of that was down to how much desire there was to get rid of the Tories no matter what. There's a slightly different story in Scotland. We can talk about things around the edges, but the fundamental myth that Labour won the election because of their strategy and because of Keir Starmer, I think, is just for the birds, that view. And it does a huge amount of damage because, frankly, when he was saying that, I very much doubt anyone in the room would believe it. And certainly the Parliamentary Labour Party wouldn't believe it. And Labour were making, under Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney, they were making terrible electoral decisions. If you just think about politics just in electoral terms, they were overstating what they thought as Labour losses to the right. They were taking for granted Labour's progressive vote coalescing on the left again. They were taking huge risks, and it was all the evidence in the polls tells you what was happening as a result of those decisions. So those decisions didn't really matter for losses of Labour's support. But I don't think the decisions that they made beforehand mattered. And let's remember that hardly anyone had much of opinion about Keir Starmer before he came in 2024. When Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak went head-to-head in their leader debate, I remember the first thing that struck me is that, well, that's the sort of first time most people would have seen these two individuals and heard them speaking in such a way. And, they were very untested as leaders beforehand. And so, claiming that the reason Keir Starmer won the election was due to him, I think, is just a great illustration of the problem.
I do remember that debate. I think even in the annals of uninspiring debates, that one was quite close to being the most uninspiring. I want to ask you about one more recent example, and then to finish, I want to ask you about Andy Burnham, because he may be a test of some of the things that we've been talking about. But you mentioned 2019 and Boris Johnson, and I think that's another election where people really do associate it with an individual. It was Johnson and his genius strategist, Dominic Cummings. That's, we've got always, there always needs to be a sort of Svengali alongside the leader. One of the things that did happen in that election, which maybe makes it a little different, is we've been talking about the importance of blocks and so on, and the way in which people are socialized in politics. And that red wall, blue wall switch, it's switched back again. But it felt like possibly here was a politician, here was a leader who was bringing people out of their traditional allegiances, maybe by force of personality. That's one thing that looked like it was happening. But of course, the other thing that was happening, not just superficially, but in fact, was he didn't do any better in vote terms than Theresa May had done. And so these two things were going on there. So how do you read 2019 and the Johnson factor?
It was a tiny improvement, like a fraction. So one of the things I started out with is I wanted to say that we can't say that leaders, some leaders may matter more under certain circumstances. And sorry, I will answer your question about Boris Johnson, but I want to talk about Nigel Farage. So when we look at reform support, UKIP support, Brexit Party support, right, what you will see that Farage was particularly influential on that vote share, both positively and negatively. Right? There was more churn. Now, the reason that could be is because he's made his party about him as an individual. It's very, very, very individual centered. The whole structure of his party, this is why they have huge difficulties in staying behind each other and everything else. But one reason might be that sort of insurgent parties don't have that ballast in their support anyway. They're not founded through sort of historical political socialization that happens in the household, all those things we talked about, those long-term factors. They're kind of shorter term phenomena. And therefore these shorter term forces could be more important. So I think there are moments and there are parties for whom leaders can be extremely influential, electorally speaking. Now that brings me back to Johnson because there are some similarities and there are some differences. And I think Johnson probably was extremely, the fact that people saw him as actually, I kind of like that guy, that's a start, that's helpful. Of course, it's not unimportant, right? But again, is it Johnson, the individual, that's really causing people to switch? Or is it Johnson, the person who finally gets Brexit done, right? So imagine another Conservative Party leader who's effective as a community, who gets people to listen, but also who fundamentally is able to really convince people that he's going to sort this Brexit thing out. And again, we've got context, right? We've got the fact that for 2 years, Parliament was in this horrible deadlock and, nobody could sort of get this thing done. Nobody could break this impasse of just turgid debate and, just a nasty politically divisive period. And so you've got that context of people just being sick and tired of it and fed up, right? So you've got that all important context. You've got someone who's going to deliver this thing, Brexit. Could it have been another leader? Perhaps they would have done well anyway. And then you've got the question of, okay, the Conservative vote share barely increased, right? But what the Conservatives did manage to do, and we can attribute some of this perhaps to Johnson, but not all of it, is around a third of Labour Leave voters switch from Labour to the Conservatives. Now, the key thing there, though, is that Labour Leave voters only constituted around a third of Labour voters, right? So you've got this small fraction of people that switched over to the Tories. So the Conservatives did manage to win over a small proportion of Labour voters who were Labour Leave voters in their Brexit referendum. And they did manage to take historically Labour seats, right? I mean, this was the symbolic nature of this as well that makes us think, gosh, that victory was huge, even when in vote share terms, it wasn't an improvement really on Theresa May. So it's the symbolic nature of that. And then again, let's remember the fact that Labour was losing votes in those places over a very long period of time that was making it possible for them to finally fall to the Conservatives. So again, you've got a luck story there that wouldn't have been at all possible 10 years previously in most of those places. But they've been trending away from Labour over a very long period of time. You get the Brexit referendum, you get the election in 2019 being about Brexit. People have had enough. And here's someone who looks like they're going to finally sort it out. And that was enough. But certainly, the victory for Johnson around was it all about him was overstated. And that's why you then got huge divisions in the Conservative Party about what they should do next. That's why that, huge arguments around what kind of a leader that they should have. And then really thinking it was all about the individual rather than about the wider Conservative brand. And it was the wider Conservative brand that was fundamentally their problem come 2024.
And it is also interesting, those two elections, 17, 19. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader in both elections, won. He did, or rather his party did, remarkably much better than they were expected to do in a campaign that may have made a difference. But he was the same guy in 2019. His personal ratings had definitely declined. And I know there is some evidence that the key event there, even though it seemed quite minor at the time, was the Salisbury poisonings and his saying, I think we need to check with Putin before we accuse Russia of having been responsible for this. So the issue of patriotism came up. But nonetheless, Jeremy Corbyn hasn't changed in 50 years. The context around him has changed, but it's not like he became a different kind of leader. But it's also the case, and this is a notorious fact of British politics, that Jeremy Corbyn got more votes in 2019 than Keir Starmer did in 2024. So all of these things do make it feel like if you just do it through the personalities, you do miss all of those structural things that you've been talking about. I want to finish with Andy Burnham and actually Nigel Farage as well, because it's possible his time in British politics may be coming to an end. And there's a question of what might happen to a very personalistic or personally led party in the absence of its driving personality. Do you think Burnham, as we record this, hasn't yet become Prime Minister, but he will be by the time this goes out, I think next week? Do you think there's already a risk that Labour are making the same mistake again, in the sense that a lot is being said about how much of a difference a change of leader will make? He's a more likable guy, he's a better communicator, he seems to connect with people in a somewhat different way. And yet it's already clear that the changes he can make are relatively limited. I have been struck by a couple of newspaper articles written under his name, which, if you just put your hand over the name at the top, could have been written under the name of Keir Starmer, as he goes out of his way to reassure people, the people he thinks he needs to reassure, including the markets. Do you think there's a risk that already Labour and Andy Burnham supporters have fallen into the trap of saying, we've got a new, better, likable model up front, and so it's all going to be okay again?
As we get Andy Burnham as our new Prime Minister, I think, let's remember why we're getting Andy Burnham as our new Prime Minister in this country. So Labour MPs didn't want to change leader fundamentally, right? They didn't want to go through this. But they are, I mean, I think, without putting too fine a point on it, they are petrified of reform and the threat of reform, the right in British politics, and the fact that in a very fragmented electoral landscape, Labour had lost so much support in such a short period of time that essentially they were just walking into an electoral disaster. And as they perceive it, not just an electoral disaster for the Labour Party, but they would see it as a fundamental disaster for the country. So there's an awful lot riding on this. And this was not something that many Labour MPs wanted to do. Now, I think what they want to see under Andy Burnham isn't just to kind of, here's a likable guy and a bounce in the polls. What they want to see is more radical change, quicker, faster, gripping, meeting the moment, addressing people's concerns, having that sense of real dynamism, structural change, and improvements in services delivery, the cost of living crisis, and all the rest of it, right? And I think the frustration there is it's not just about Keir Starmer, it was about Keir Starmer's way of doing politics that just wasn't meeting the moment. Now, the tricky thing here is the polls could see a bit of a bounce because people will be more interested in Andy Burnham. It's also going to happen at a time when Reform UK are going through their sort of political nadir. They're going through a horrible time in terms of the stories that are coming out about Nigel Farage, the by-election in Nigel Farage's constituency, and all the rest of it. So, there's very likely to be a poll bounce. And that will be attributed to this nice guy called Andy Burnham, who seems more likable. Now, I think with Andy Burnham, though, and why did he do so well in the Makerfield by-election? What he had in the Northwest is a reputation for not just someone people liked more, but also fundamentally, again, about delivery. He was seen as somebody who had delivered for the Northwest, who had addressed not everything, but various different concerns in the Northwest. And he fought an election campaign that was very much about sort of giving the messages that bridged across political divides as opposed to just sort of picked within a side. So it's very much about cost of living, very much about doing politics differently, addressing this sense of huge disillusionment and anger that people have around, politics just not delivering for people and serving people's interests. So here he comes in with something that he has in the Northwest. Now, the question is, can he do it nationally, right? So he had it in the Northwest because he was seen to deliver. He was seen as more competent. He was seen as someone also who represented the Northwest in a sort of identity kind of way. And now he's got to translate that nationally. And that is a yet to be seen. Yes, there could be a poll bounce, but can he do that nationally? And that's a huge, huge ask. And then the other question is, well, there's two more. One is he going to set policy direction in a way that the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, have been kind of aching for over the last 2 years? And then also, how is he going to respond to all of the destabilizing external geopolitical events that, of course, distract? Of course they do. Of course, they also tend to result in all kinds of buffeting on any government. And those costs of ruling, the fact that governments tend to come in and lose support over time, can he overturn what is the most common trend that we see in opinion polling across the world and over time? These are hugely difficult things. So he's got an uphill battle. And I think, the fact that clearly that he's personable, that he likes politics, he likes talking to people, he seems more comfortable, those are all things that obviously are going to be helpful. But the structural things are going to be fundamentally what determines his success.
And as you suggested, it seems like one of the things that could happen here is it's quite a propitious time for him to take over in the sense that not only is Nigel Farage fighting Count Binface, the Green vote looks softer than it did, and he may be well suited to take advantage of that. There could be an international event, but actually, if he's a fresh face and if it happens when people are still relatively warmly disposed to him, they often rally round the leader in those circumstances. I can imagine that in a year's time, Labour are doing considerably better than they are doing now. And the lesson that's drawn from this is it's good to have a more likable leader. The frustration, the thing I think we've both been sort of getting at here is that, of course, leadership matters a certain amount, other things matter more. But we have a tendency when something changes, the sort of confirmation bias is to see it as confirming our view. And the Labour Party might conclude this, that changing the leader is the thing that made the difference, whereas actually maybe what made the difference was a change in the wider context, the wider circumstances. And so that aspect of British politics, which has really been prevalent since 2016, which is to keep chopping and changing through leaders in the hope of finding the one that sticks. When the one does stick, it's not because you chopped and changed leaders, it's because the circumstances are different. I have a lot of sympathy with Keir Starmer on this point, which is I think they turfed him out just at the point where he might have benefited from some of these changes too, and might have changed the way people thought about him. But there is, I think, at least, I don't know what you think, but I think there's a danger that actually the lesson that will be drawn from the next 2 years in British politics is the thing that we've been slightly pushing against, more than slightly pushing against. People will think, Burnham proves that actually you're much better off with a nice guy.
Now, clearly what we're not saying here is pick someone that no one likes. Pick a sort of Marmite politician or, pick someone who's absolutely dull and doesn't really like talking to cameras. I mean, like, clearly that's ridiculous, right? But so here's what could happen. We could see not just, the mood music change, right? So if there's a poll bounce, what I've seen is there can be virtuous cycles in politics as well as vicious cycles, right? If there's a poll bounce and the newspapers get behind Burnham and people start talking positively about him and Labour MPs are really enthusiastic. Oh, and by the way, now your kind of main rival on the right is in internal warfare and picking a new leader and you don't have any kind of realistic opposition at the moment, then that really could be a huge bounce for the Labour Party. But it's not just about one individual, right? It's about the narrative around politics changing. But what I suspect will happen, and I don't, I'm not making a prediction here, but what I would guess will happen is that there will just be a honeymoon under a Burnham period of leadership that Keir Starmer just didn't enjoy. Because the reverse of that was when everything seemed to be going wrong. There's a vicious cycle then that people pile on and everything's negative and your MPs start being incredibly unhappy and all of the rest of it. So I'd imagine that there'll be a period of time where Labour will benefit under a Burnham premiership. The question then is, will it sustain? And will it sustain long enough before an election? And of course, will he choose to have an election? He's ruled out an immediate election, but will he choose to have an election when things are looking good? And then he obviously will get way more credit too. So, or will things run for a period of time where Labour starts to be judged more negatively? And obviously he won't want to go into election under those circumstances. So the ability to pick the timing of the election can also come into this of looking like a fortuitous moment, which is, of course, not all just by chance.
And at the risk of oversimplifying it, one of the things that does seem to be true across the range of things we've talked about here is that leaders can definitely screw up. No question, Gordon Brown made a huge mistake with suggesting he would call an election and not calling it. That didn't determine anything, but it changed the narrative of his premiership. Leaders matter more when they screw it up than they do in securing the good outcomes that are attributed to them. Would you say it's fair as a summary to say that, or do you think I've oversimplified it?
I would say let's go back to the direct and indirect effects. So I think the indirect effects of leaders always matter. Policy, strategy, direction, unity, governing competence, and all the rest of it, right? But the direct effects of leaders seem to matter the most when there's a huge, huge gaffe, disaster, misstep, when suddenly the only thing you hear about that party is a negative and it's because of the leader. But it's very rare that the only thing that you hear that's positive about a party is because of the leader, right? It's normally about what the leader embodies, what they epitomize, what they're communicating. But yeah, disasters for leaders draw attention on a political party and its ability to govern and its ability to maintain confidence in a way like nothing else. And that makes perfect sense.
And perhaps most fatally of all, leaders can become figures of fun. I mean, Liz Truss is a lettuce. Nigel Farage may be associated with the bin for the rest of his career. And there's no positive version of that, but the negative version of it, we don't know with Farage how it will go. There are all sorts of ways it can go. But when you are associated in the public mind with ridicule, I think that's really hard to come back from.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know how to respond, David, beyond saying can't get much worse than being likened to a lettuce.
We have plenty more bad ideas to come in this series, and next time I'm talking to the philosopher Nikhil Krishnan about one of the dominant ideas of the modern age. It is an idea whose influence is everywhere, and we're going to be exploring its many pitfalls. It's the idea of utilitarianism. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.